All right. I want to welcome everybody this morning to the FPSA's Bakery Council webinar Beyond BISSC, Evolving Hygienic Standards in Baking. Today we're going to explore how the sanitation criteria in baking has evolved and what these changes mean for both producers and equipment OEMs moving forward. I want to let everybody know that the event is being brought to you by the Food Production Solutions Association. FPSA, it's a dynamic community of food producers, manufacturers, suppliers, and service providers. It's the only association that brings together really the entire food industry across all the segments and all of those involved in the food production process. The goal of FPSA is to create a collaborative environment that brings together all of the industry leaders, experts, and innovators and provides a meaningful platform for education, industry engagement, and philanthropy too. So together, FPSA and its members are shaping the future of food production. If you'd like to learn more about FPSA, if you're not familiar with us, you can visit fpsa.org and get a preview of the resources available for members and for non-members. Now, with that introduction out of the way, we're going to get on to the main event. As I mentioned, my name's Chuck Sena. I am the vice chair of the Bakery Council of FPSA. And in my day job, I am the Director of Food and Beverage Solutions at Midwest Engineered Systems. I've been providing a variety of packaging machinery, processing, and product handling solutions over the last 30 plus years, primarily serving the food industry. And in fact, the last 7 or 8 years of my career have been focused probably 99% plus on food industry solutions. I am delighted to be joined today by a couple of voices and people who are also very experienced in the industry. John Anderson is the managing consultant for the Bakery Equipment Assessment Group, and Karl Thorson is the food and safety sanitation manager at General Mills. I'm going to give them each a chance to kind of introduce themselves a little bit before we get into the meat of the discussion. John, would you like to go first?
Sure. Thank you, Chuck. And it's great to see you again, Karl, and be with you. I got my start in the food industry with AIB a very long time ago, back in 1982. Started out in food safety and did that for quite a long time, and then got involved in occupational safety and health and developed the education and consulting side of occupational safety and health at AIB. But along the way, I became involved in equipment design for food safety. And I did that for quite a few years while at AIB, and then left in 2014 and started my own business and became associated with the American Society of Baking when they asked me to help acquire BISSC from AIB and rebrand the organization and kind of give the BEAG, the Bakery Equipment Assessment Group, a new lease on life and improve the Hygienic Equipment Design Certification Program. And so that brings me to where we are today. So that's a little bit of my background.
Well, thanks for joining us. And Karl, tell us a little bit about your background and your sphere of influence.
Yes, thanks for having me, and great to see you both. And thanks for everybody joining us today. So I've been with General Mills for coming up on 30 years now. Started out with the Pillsbury Company and came along with the acquisition there. So I worked at a few different manufacturing facilities, bakery related, and then in quality, sanitation, even operations, and then corporate roles in operations, quality, and then for the last 15 years have been leading our sanitation program globally for General Mills. So I'm located here close to our corporate offices here in Minneapolis, and yeah, I'm a food scientist by degree and grew up on my family farms up here in central Minnesota, so I'm within a couple hours of that location. So yeah, nice to be here today. Thanks for having us.
All right. Well, again, I appreciate both of you making time to be a part of this discussion today. Before we dive into it, I forgot something earlier. We are going to try and have some time for Q&A at the end. So if the people who are watching, if you want to use either the Q&A window to ask any questions, we'll try and get to them at the end. Also, if you want to use the chat function, we'll be monitoring that too. And as we go through the conversation, we'll be keeping an eye, and some of them, the questions we may address earlier on, depending on what the topic is. Some we may wait till the end. So if there are some things you'd like us to address, put them out there, and we'll try to get to them. That being said, let's start out with a little bit of a history lesson. John, you kind of touched on it earlier that there's been an evolution in the standards, going from AIB to ASB and to BEAG kind of being the caretaker today. Can you kind of walk us through the history of that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. In fact, I might start a little bit earlier than that. I'll start with the beginning of BISSC, or the Baking Industry Sanitation Standards Committee. Well, it was 1949. It was right on the heels of World War II. The food industry, and particularly the fast food industry, was booming. It just took off like a shot. And along with that, the baking industry moved right along with it. And with that increase in production, there was the need to develop hygienic design standards. They didn't refer to them as hygienic design standards back then. It was sanitation standards for bakery equipment. And the baking industry and the baking production equipment industry wanted to get out ahead of the federal government and write their own standards. They didn't want the standards written for them. So they came together, and there was a group of people from the baking industry and from the equipment design industry that came together and wrote the standards. And it took several years to do that, from around the late 40s to maybe about the mid 50s. It took that long to develop those standards. But during that process, the group of manufacturers, equipment manufacturers, and the group of bakers kind of changed and evolved. At times you would have more bakers, at times you would have more equipment manufacturers. So really wasn't a balance. So some agendas got met, some didn't. And over time, those standards evolved to include specific standards on all the different types of the unique types of equipment that you'll find in a bakery, from ovens to slicers to rounders to molders and that sort of thing. So the standards developed with one section, was the primary general equipment design section. And then section 4, that was section 3, and then section 4 was specific to the different equipment. But the standards were really not keeping up with the times necessarily. But over a period of time towards the 60s, the mid 60s, early 60s, manufacturers started to advertise their equipment as meeting the BISSC standard. And with that, the BISSC organization realized that they need to have maybe a certification process or a way to govern or track the commitments or the statements that equipment manufacturers were making to make sure that it did, in fact, meet the standard. And so that's how the Baking Industry Sanitation Standards Office of Certification got started. It was in the mid 60s. And so through that, the standard continued to develop and change and evolve. And that certification process became highly respected. And it was utilized by pretty much all of the equipment manufacturers that produced equipment for the baking industry. And then around 2003 to 2005, there was a perceived need from the BISSC Board of Directors to have AIB International acquire the certification program, because AIB International was was very prominent in food safety. So around the 2003 timeframe, uh, as an AIB employee, I was involved in acquiring BISSC for AIB. And then we ran that program from 2007 to about 2014 when I left AIB. And it was growing, and it was managing itself pretty well. It was holding its own. There was slight growth. There was always continued interest by the equipment manufacturers and by the bakers, the end users of the equipment. But after I left AIB, the focus at AIB shifted and changed more towards the food safety education and food safety inspection, and less towards bakery education and a bakery focus. So BISSC kind of just lingered for a while without much focus at all. And the baking industry, and under the leadership of ASB at the time, realized that there was a need to acquire that business, that certification program from AIB. And so probably 4 years ago, that's exactly what happened. The process of acquiring BISSC from AIB by ASB took place. And we realized that we need to have a refocus on the standard. And around 2003, when that standard became an ANSI standard, we realized that we need to focus on the value and the respectability of an ANSI standard, because now with that ANSI development, we had a balance of bakers, we had a balance of equipment manufacturers, and we had continual review of that standard. So now there was no agenda, there was no advantage by one group or the other. The focus of that standard was purely on hygienic design and food safety for the baking industry. And so as ASB took over, we revamped the whole certification process by requiring an educational piece and an inspection piece by the equipment manufacturer, as well as a real focus on that ANSI standard and the relativity of that standard and the value of that standard. So that's kind of the evolution of where BISSC was and how we came to where we're at now, with an increase in the respectability and the focus on hygienic design for certification.
Well, thanks for, kind of catching us on how we got to where we are today. Now, Karl, from your perspective as an end user and a baker that, purchases this equipment and has to use it, clean it, and make sure that it complies with your food safety. As you're making decisions, how do the standards influence that decision-making process?
Right. So with that advancement, and as John described, has come major changes in the expectation of the food industry, right? Like, we have learned so much over the last few decades from a micro standpoint, obviously pathogens and spoilage organisms, but so many other things that we need to clean and maintain for so many different health standards and things, gluten-free, allergen control, kosher, halal, organic, so many different things that it's so critical that we have good standards to start with and understand, hey, we've got to put in front of you what are those success criteria, and then we have to have those design standards, because that's the foundation of everything. We've got to have a good kitchen and equipment in that kitchen, right, on a large scale to deliver safe, quality food efficiently. So it's extremely important that we're talking off the same page and off the same standards, and working towards those goals to make sure we're not running into those extreme issues with inefficiencies, but then also food safety and quality issues to our consumers.
Okay. Well, I'd like to talk a little bit about, I call it the balancing act between hygienic design and the other competing interests that there are. I've had it expressed to me that hygienic design in a way is kind of like art, and that people will have their own interpretation and takeaway from that. And between John on the standard side and Karl on the implementation side, how do you balance all of the different competing interests between the purest form of hygienic design with the practicalities of applying it in a for-profit operation?
Well, I think that in developing the standards, it's important to have, like I mentioned, that balance. You have to have a balance of bakers with their interests. You have to have a balance of equipment manufacturers with their interests. And there's also another component in there, the food safety individuals, the food safety experts. And together, as I have noticed clearly, as those standards are revised, reviewed, and worked on, there are there is a central goal. And that central goal is to make sure that the equipment is designed so that it can be cleaned efficiently. And by being able to clean it efficiently, we avoid the product contamination issues, and we make sure that our consumers are protected. And by doing that, we protect our business, we protect the brand name of that company that we work for, and we protect our consumers and ourselves because we are certainly consumers, and we're focused on mothers and fathers and daughters and sons and grandparents and that sort of thing to make sure that they're safe and protected. So I think there's an overarching goal that we reach when we come together and work towards that sanitary goal of equipment design.
Okay.
Right. And I think that's an very important part is bringing together the right people, right? Getting everybody a seat at the table, and communication is critical. So understanding that the realities are there's some competing interests there, right? Like we're trying to do food safety and human safety, right? And sometimes those clash, but we got to make sure we're sitting down and meeting both of those requirements. And so it's always helpful to have standards to start with, right? And have that foundation so we can all talk about and understand, what does success look like? What are the success criteria? What is it that I need to do from a guarding standpoint? What can I do to make sure that I still have access for cleaning and things? So making sure that we have clear communication, clear success criteria, and that's done early on, right? And there's no surprises, right? Like my job is to make sure there's no surprises, right? I want to be upfront about my expectations on cleanliness. What am I going to do for sensory evaluation, right? Meaning visual inspection, getting into analytical testing. What am I going to need for time and budget to meet those criteria? And making sure that everybody is well aware of those, and we can budget for time and resources. So every time we've worked on efficiencies, we've always gotten better on effectiveness for managing food safety and quality.
Okay. Well, you're kind of leading into something I was going to bring up a little later, but I'm going to jump the schedule here a little bit. Both of you talked about having a lot of people as come to the party and come to the table on this. It sounds like you're talking about a culture of food safety in the facility. What are some things that, Karl, from your standpoint, that you do to try to build that culture? And on the standard side, how can the standards organizations and the OEMs providing the equipment help contribute to that?
Right. So again, my job is to make sure that I'm communicating those across the board and making sure everybody's aligned on the outcomes, right? I've got a message for everyone, right? If we do this right, I'm going to reduce human safety risk. I'm going to reduce risk to the environment, improve sustainability. I'm going to improve operational efficiencies. So I want to come to the table with those messages and those metrics and make sure, and I've got, John's great at this too, telling a good story, right? Like I've got to bring that story and case studies and showing what that can, in data, but the stories are even better to show them how things maybe haven't gone well in the past, and how when we implement and standardize things, things improve, and the benefits that go with that.
Well, and one of the things that that I've talked about with folks, with clients and people that are involved in the certification program or wanting to get involved, looking to get involved. In a perfect world, if the end user, if the baker is going to look to purchase a piece of equipment, if they internally got maintenance involved, quality, sanitation, and employee safety involved in that decision-making process, then I think the end result is something that is going to be a much better investment in that particular business. They may pay a little bit more upfront, but the efficiencies that are built in and the problems and the surprises that Karl talks about, trying to avoid those, are avoided by looking at the equipment and making sound decisions when you purchase that equipment and using, and I'll fold in the standard, using those standards as the criteria by which you look at purchasing a piece of equipment in terms of that hygienic design, with the mindset that I'm investing in my company, I'm investing in my business. I might spend a little bit more upfront, but the return on investment with lower labor costs, higher yield, increased production, uptime, less maintenance downtime, less sanitation downtime, then in the long run, I think we've purchased a piece of equipment that is serving our company and our business very well.
I want to interject here. There was a question from the audience about making the differentiation between sanitary design and cleanability. Would one of you like to speak to that, how you make that distinction and why it's important?
Karl, you want to handle that one?
Yeah, so I think about cleanability and very specific expectations, right, around like I said, sensory, making sure that it meets the visual assessment and then analytical. But sanitary design, hygienic design, I think is much broader than that, right? It's encompasses not only food safety and quality, but efficiencies as well, right? And that's by definition. We've got to make sure that we're minimizing labor, we're minimizing time and disruption, reducing plan losses overall, right? That could be in the changeover process, but it could be in master sanitation schedule and cleaning the rest of the facility and preventing, this massive amount of downtime to clean as a preventative measure or reactive. Yeah, so that's kind of how I think about the difference between those different terms.
Okay. Okay. Um, Getting back to, what you've been seeing out there in the market, what are some of the things that both of you have seen that are maybe current accepted practices that need to be reconsidered? Things that people are doing common that if they in design or in implementation, that if they just did something a little bit differently, it would make a big impact uh, in terms of food safety and ensuring that all the stakeholders are going to deliver safe quality food.
Well, I would say quickly, and Karl, I think you'll agree with me, if the end users could encourage, or if the design engineers could take could see that it would be important to spend time on the production floor and watch the cleanup happen. Watch what people have to do in order to interact with that equipment, to break it down and clean it, and then put it back together again so it's operational and there aren't any issues later on. I think having that exposure would, by the design engineers and the folks at the plant site interacting with the engineers, would help tremendously in giving the design engineer the idea of how to innovate and how to create and how to build equipment that is easy to break down and clean, to Karl's point, to get to that aspect of cleanability and avoid particular issues. To me, that would be a huge impact.
Oh, I'm in violent agreement. you think about what people deal with in their own kitchens. They're like, oh, I clean my KitchenAid mixer to make some cookie dough. Well, imagine that on a scale of a ton, making a ton of cookie dough and managing that. So people just don't understand the gravity of that, managing that level of volume and things. So I think that's extremely important, and they just don't have that experience, right? So I'm always a fan of getting boots on the ground and getting out there and checking it out. The other one that I would bring up is is very, very basic. I talk basics all the time, right? And one of the key things is early on in projects, I'll ask very simple questions. I'm trying to facilitate, again, understanding of the goals and success criteria. But one of the key questions is, hey, by area, by unit operation, am I going to wet or dry clean? Right? That drives a lot of decisions, right? Like if I make that decision to go down the path of using water, that's going to impact my facility design, infrastructure. I've got to put drains in, sloped floors, different coatings for floors, electrical standards, all these kind of things. So getting upfront with those expectations, because a lot of people just default to, oh, it has to be all flood cleaned or all wet cleaned. And that's not necessarily true, especially in this space in bakeries. We want to minimize that. If anybody's heard me speak on this, the war on water and trying to control moisture in our environment is critically important for lots of different reasons. But I think that's one to get a handle on to start with, because it prevents a lot of I've seen projects where they spent a lot of money on making it wet wash down, and I'm like, you could have designed it for dry cleaning and we'd be in a much better space, saved a lot of money on the upfront capital, and been a much more manageable system going forward from reliability, human safety, environmental, food safety, all of these reasons. So that one I really try to get in front of right away.
I'm going to follow up on that one a little bit because as the voice of an equipment supplier in the conversation, one of the challenges that we see oftentimes is that under FSMA, each company, each baker, each food company defines what their key risks are and develops an individualized plan for mitigation on that. And one of the things you talked about, wet versus dry cleaning, how what's the best way to approach some of these things and have that conversation with your equipment supplier? Because again, it's not a one size fits all solution for everybody. And John, with your experience also, how can that be addressed in the process, and what are some of the advantages and disadvantages to using different methodologies and how they can impact what's needed in the hygienic design?
Right. And I think it's important to, first off, just have the conversation, right? You've got to have an early management process that you get the right people involved early on, because I've seen so many times where the right people haven't been brought to the table, or they haven't been brought until late in the game. So getting involved early is critically important. Okay, go back to the question again. I got distracted there a little bit.
That's okay. As I said, a challenge from the OEM equipment manufacturer side of things is that each company defines what mix of temperature, mechanical action, chemical action, all of those things that go into a cleaning process and a sanitation process for their risks. And as you mentioned, those can have an impact on how you end up designing the equipment.
Right. So going back to the water example, but even more broadly, is I'm by exception kind of principle, right? Like, let's only do this if you can justify it, right? Like, we have a hierarchy of cleaning methods, right? Like the first choice is, how do we design it so I don't have to clean, or I don't have to clean regularly? And there's lots of examples of that, right? Designing certain facility design, as well as delivery systems, unit ops, things like that. Why, I design a bulk oil system that should be designed so I don't have to regularly clean that, right? Like, it's a very stable system if managed properly. I want to focus people more on inspection versus cleaning. Like, know what you're going to look for. Am I going to look for what defects am I going to see? And then react to those defects or put in place things to prevent those defects from happening versus a lot of times I go into systems and people are like, oh, well, we clean this every so often. And I'm like, but why do you do that? I don't know. We just always done it that way. I'm like, no, no, no. What's the science behind that? Tell me what defect you're trying to prevent or address, and how can we avoid that, and understand it better so we can challenge the method of cleaning, the design, the frequency, all of those things, and generally, we're getting a much higher quality, more focused design and clean with those types of interactions when we involve the right people.
Okay. And John, if you could kind of look at this from a little bit different angle, and that being the ANSI standards that have been developed and the certification process that BIAG offers, uh, how do they complement the range of hygienic design levels, as it were, uh, so that when somebody looks at it and they say, yes, it adheres to this standard, you know that it's going to be, suitable for different types of environments.
Well, that's one of the advantages of having a relatively large group of people involved in that Z50 committee that reviews the standard. You've got bakers, you've got equipment manufacturers, and people in food safety. And when you look at the standard and you spend time reading the standard, you see that it's pretty diverse in how it approaches those concepts. I think the hazard analysis that and the risk assessment that Karl's talking about is up to the baker, the end user. But as that standard is used to develop the criteria for their equipment, they see that there's an electrical section, and it does address the equipment that's used in wet wash down environments. It's obviously it's geared more towards the dry environment because that's what the baking industry is more suited for in terms of its cleaning. But I think the standards that are developed, whether it's the ANSI Z50.2 equipment design standard for bakery equipment or any other standard, will look at those issues, those particular issues, and if they're worth the paper they're written on, they will build in those hazard assessments and the risk that the baker has to face on a day in and day out basis. And with the knowledge of the various regulations that the equipment manufacturers need to have in terms of the safe design of equipment, I think that all goes into the total concept of a review and hazard assessment and risk analysis and the use of standards as the criteria for selecting equipment.
Yeah.
And,
Go ahead, Karl.
yeah, no, I was just going to emphasize, I think it's so important that they do have those specifics related to specific unit operations because it is so different, right? You look at, you can't just look at an entire production line. You've got to look individually because that risk assessment is very different for an oven versus a mixer, right? And how I'm going to handle those. So I've got to look at them each individually and even to the component level, like you mentioned the electronics and electrical components and things too. So it's work, but it's well worth it to dig into that level of detail and make sure that again nobody's surprised when it doesn't meet the expectations of any one of those cross-functional team members.
And I just might jump in and add one thought, and it's kind of an outdated thought, but I still hear this come up. People tend to say, well, we don't really have to worry too much about equipment design. We don't have to worry too much about the process. And they still refer to this, even though it's outdated. We have a kill step in the baking industry. And so that cures all ills that we might have. I'm hearing it still, but less than I did a few years back. We can't think that way. We've got to think in terms of the total production, total process, and the design.
Absolutely. There's so many examples where the kill process, that's only one risk, right? That's from a bacteria. And even from a bacteria standpoint, preformed toxins can be created up front, right? So those toxins can make it through a heat step with no impact, right? And still cause illness. Allergens are not going to be cooked out of a system. There's all kinds of quality food safety things that are not addressed by just a lethality or kill step. So
Yeah.
great point.
And not to mention foreign material. So,
Exactly. Yeah, you're not going to cook that out.
yeah.
Um, Before we go on, there's another question from the audience about the standards themselves. How do the ANSI standards compare to the European sanitation standards? I'm assuming they're referring to EHEDGE, and I'm not sure if it's good to get into the minutia of that, but just in general, how similar or different are they?
Well, I have done a side-by-side comparison of the ANSI Z50.2 Bakery Equipment Sanitary Design Standard that we use, that BEAG uses as the criteria for conformity to design, and EHEDGE, and some of the other standards that are out there. And they're very comparable. There's not a whole lot new under the sun as far as design and how you avoid product contamination from the three issues: chemical, biological, and foreign material. There really isn't a whole lot new under the sun, but the advantage that I see that the Z50.2 Bakery Equipment Design Standard has is that it focuses on the baking industry. And it could be, you could even use that and grow that to the low moisture foods industry, all of that. And that's where that focus is at. That's where the Z50.2 standard, I think, has its advantage.
Okay. That it's kind of interesting. While you were answering that question, another one popped up about why is the ANSI verified standard that ASB holds the distinguishing factor in the industry? And I think you just spoke to that. It's something that it's focused uniquely on the different challenges for the baking industry.
Yeah. Well, and one thing I didn't mention was ASB does manage that ANSI Z50.2 standard, not BEAG, where in the past BISSC managed their own standard, and there was a conflict of interest there if you really want to get down to the brass tacks. But now ASB manages that standard. BEAG uses that standard to show through that certification process the equipment has conformed to a standard that is written through that ANSI rulemaking process, completely separate and not associated necessarily directly with BEAG. It's managed by the American Society of Baking.
Okay. That's an excellent distinction. Kind of reminds me of what you might see with some of the third-party certifications for food plants, SQF and BRC, and the various inspection and auditory certifications that are available for the foods plants themselves. It's the same principle being applied to the equipment that's going into those facilities.
Yeah, and I might add that every one of those certification inspection requirements by BRC or whomever and the FDA require that the equipment used in a food production plant in our bakeries conforms to a design standard that is built with food safety and hygienic design in mind. Every single standard requires that.
Okay. I want to make sure we leave some time for a little bit more Q&A at the end. We've got one question here. I'm going to save for a little bit later. Todd, I'll bring your question up in just a little bit. But before we get to that, what's next? What sort of things do you see on the horizon with reformulations, some of the regulatory uncertainty that's going ahead? What are things that you're anticipating that the industry is going to have to pay attention to and could cause disruption?
Yeah, so from my standpoint, it's embracing, the technology going forward and utilizing tools. I mean, I started out looking at, 2D drawings, and now I can see 3D models. I can even use augmented reality. There's one project I put on Oculus lenses and could virtually walk through the system before it was ever built. which was extremely helpful to me because you always run into those situations. You're like, oh my gosh, that drain is underneath that piece of equipment, or that the door on the oven doesn't open all the way. There's a column in the way, and you can kind of walk through some of those accessibility and interaction kind of things that you want to check out in that. So having the ability to look at things and in more detail and walk through that process with those tools has been extremely helpful. And then using, other tools, the problem with sanitation and that plan losses is we don't have a lot of data because our machines are shut down, right? If I'm running CIP or things like that, I've got a lot of data and analytics coming at me. But with manual cleaning, how do we get that information on what tasks are being completed, how much time it's taking, what sequence of events, right? It's a touchy space because it is humans, right? And we're worried about not, Big Brother watching you, but we've got to take advantage of those things and the food safety and human safety aspects of that, right? These sensors or cameras to make sure that lockout tagout was implemented, or that the surface actually got to visibly clean, or that, things were taken apart and put back together to the expectation so we don't have defects, damage, those types of things. So I think there's a lot to embrace going forward with technology.
Yeah, I would agree, Karl. And I tend to be old school, but when new ideas come up, my first thought is I don't see that happening. But I think I with as fast as technology is advancing now, I think there's some real hope and real potential. I think, and I just saw, an article on infrared technology used on quality in the baking industry. I think we're going to see an upsurge in technology. I think we're going to see probably sensors or AI being able to determine the level of clean that we've got and where our potential is for problems, whether it's predictive or preventative maintenance, or whether it's predictive or preventative food safety issues. A couple of years ago, I was in a conversation with a group of people, and somebody said, "Wouldn't it be nice if we got to the point where technology could clean equipment automatically, self-cleaning equipment?" And I thought, "Wow, that's never going to happen." Well, I think I'm changing my view on that. I think it's going to happen. I think with AI and some of the sensors that are being developed, that's going to happen. So I see that potentially as being part of the future. That might be way down the line. It may be science fiction to most, but I think I see that happening. But what I do see in reality happening, and kind of shifting gears a little bit on standards focus, is I see more states, more counties, and more local health departments requiring that the equipment used in food service and in food production facilities, commercial and wholesale food production facilities, showing proof and verification that the equipment used has been verified by a certification program to meet hygienic design standards. I see that happening more and more. It began years ago when I was with AIB, but it's starting to happen more and more. The California Retail Food Code is a good example. Now it requires certification of equipment that goes into food service, and more states and counties and local municipalities are making that requirement. I'm seeing it in Wisconsin too. So that in and of itself is growing, and that's going to be a move forward. Where in the baking industry, we may not have a regulatory requirement that requires us to show certification and verification of conformance to a design standard, but I think it's coming. I really do. I think it's coming quicker than we will want it to.
Well,
Right.
that ties in. Oh, I was going to say just quickly, someone asked about there are people out there, companies out there that are still putting BISSC stickers or certification on their equipment. Does that mean anything anymore?
No, no, that's, I'm sorry to answer so quickly, but that's kind of a sore point with me. I did manage BISSC, I ran BISSC, and I have a lot of, my heart is back with those old times, but As I walked through the floors at IBIE, back in September, I saw equipment that still had BISSC symbols on equipment that's brand new. They did not go through a certification process. They're putting a sticker on there that means absolutely nothing. BISSC does not exist anymore. BEAG is the certification program for the baking industry.
Okay. And Karl, I'm sorry I cut you off there. You were going to kind of uh, finish out what John was talking about before.
Oh, now I lost my train of thought. I was so listening to John there that I lost it.
Right, Karl.
It'll come back to me. Go ahead.
Well, I was talking about, how things are moving forward with regulation, city and statewide.
Oh, yes. So that reminds me, right? Because again, as we talked about success criteria, things are getting more and more complicated, right? There's so many more expectations, health expectations, analytical tests, right? Like testing to, parts per million, parts per billion for these different things. So you've got to have the equipment right along lockstep with you to be able to meet those standards, right? My job is to make sure that I'm delivering a system, a facility, equipment that can deliver whatever R&D comes up with, whatever the consumer needs and wants, right? I don't want to be like, oh, we can't do that because I can't clean up in between those formulas or those products. So I got to give ultimate flexibility for, whatever the ingredient and challenge might be.
Okay. We're getting close to the end of time here. I'm going to go back to Todd's question that I promised earlier that I would be answering. Um, I think this was specifically for you, Karl. He said he'd be interested in visiting your facility and seeing your sanitation of equipment, um, and seeing the challenges firsthand. I know that that can be a tough ask. What suggestions do you have for people who would like to, have opportunities to do that? Is it as simple as ask your customer, or should they go through something like some of these third-party cleaning services and shadowing their crews? What advice can you give on that?
Yeah, no, I think it starts with that conversation, right? And saying, hey, what's our goal, right? And setting out those expectations. Like, I'd like to get in there and see and experience what's going on there, right? Like, because I agree with, again, what John said earlier. It's so important to see the extremes. It's one thing to, design and build and think about the operation of the equipment. We don't spend a lot of time thinking about the really invasive processes of tearing it down, cleaning it, maintaining it, those types of things. I had a great engineer years ago that worked on CIP and Yoplait, and he was like, "My goal is to build a CIP system that also runs yogurt." He said it's way more complex to design a system that's cleanable than to make the product. So getting that mindset of how do we design a system that's cleanable, maintainable, meets all these goals, but then also makes high quality, safe food, right? Efficiently. Yep.
Okay.
So yeah, it starts with making that contact, right? And just being very clear and transparent with the goal.
Okay. Well, I don't have any other open questions right now. I think we appreciate you guys being generous with your time on it. I want to give you each a couple of minutes just for some closing comments, and I threatened this before the meeting. Standard parting question that I have is for the people who are listening to this conversation, if they only take one thing away from this time today, what do you hope that is?
Well, I can start quickly here, John. It's pretty simple for me, and I've kind of changed my focus over the year. You get away from ego and everything. It's like realizing that you don't have all the answers, right? But we have resources that are amazing, right? Like I work with industry groups, colleges, universities. There's tools and the ability to use the internet and all of these things. It's like realize you've got to have a foundational level of technical capability in your role and things, but reach out to those experts, right? Utilize the expertise, right? Reach out to the Johns of the world in his organization and others. Take advantage of these industry organization and go to the educational classes and all of these types of things. So I really focus on giving my teams, yes, we do training and cover topics and things, but ultimately at the end of the day, I'm giving them a list of resources, links, people, content that they can go back to at the end of the day, because they're not going to remember all this, right? But giving them those resources to fall back on to move forward.
Yeah, and I'm really glad you asked that question, because I'd like to answer it with the story. The longer you're around, the longer you exist on this planet, about all you have are stories. But this story happened. This happened about 15, 17 years ago, and I've never forgotten it. And it's going to involve an equipment design engineer, but you could say it could also refer to somebody in food safety, somebody in quality, somebody in leadership, a leadership role in a food plant. But I was putting on a seminar for equipment design, and the room was full of about 30 different equipment design engineers for different manufacturing companies. And so the first part of the seminar got into the history of food safety, where food safety regulations started and how they got to where we're at now. And about halfway through that conversation, I started talking about allergens and allergen control, and how equipment design is so fundamental to food safety, and how it's fundamental to preventing allergen cross-contamination and issues there, along with microbiological and foreign material contamination. The whole time I was talking, there was a gentleman, young man, in the back of the room, and I assumed he had a ball cap on, and I couldn't see his eyes, and I just assumed he was sound asleep. I don't profess to be a stimulating speaker, but there have been a few people that have fallen asleep during my seminar, so I wasn't too surprised. But I was a little bit focused on him for whatever reason. And as I started talking about allergen control and how equipment design prevents allergen contamination, cross-contamination, he started to sit back. He was kind of leaning way back in his chair, but he kind of sat up and leaned into the conversation, and I could see his eyes. And as I got basically through with the allergen conversation, he raised his hand, and before I could call on him, he said, "Now I know why I'm here." Those were his exact words. "Now I know why I'm here. My boss sent me here. I thought I have no input, no reason, no interest, nothing to do with food safety whatsoever. I design machines. That's my job. But now I know why I'm here. My son is 8 years old, and he's allergic to every single one of those food allergens that you just talked about. Every single one of them. And in fact, my wife and I and he have to carry EpiPens because he could go into anaphylactic shock at any time. So now you have just explained to me why I am here and what my role is, because one of the things that we have to worry about, and these are words verbatim, when we go to the grocery store, when my wife and I go to the grocery store to buy food for the family, for my son, it's like, and I quote, walking through a landmine, because we have to trust the companies that manufacture these food products, that they have an allergen control program in place that's effective and will not cause my son to have an allergic reaction and go into anaphylactic shock. Now I know why I'm here. So that to me is the takeaway, whether you're an equipment design engineer or a baker or a food manufacturer. We're here. Our main goal and focus is to prevent product contamination and keep our consumers safe, and to keep our business safe and the brand reputation safe. So that's the one takeaway I would offer up.
Well, thank you both very much for your time. There was one last question that came in here. I'm going to just read it live. What are the standards that equipment manufacturers follow to incorporate their equipment into facilities humidity explosion, hazardous electrical standards. Um, boy, that's a long one. I would point people to the ANSI standards that we've been talking about throughout here as a great starting point for that. Uh, and as we wrap up here, John, do you want to share the website, how people can find out more about BEAG and those ANSI standards?
Yes, the website is beag.org. And when you go onto that, or I'm sorry, let me double check. I think it's BEAG Group, but yes, BEAG Group, 1G, BEAGROUP.org. When you go onto that website, the whole certification process can be done online. You can also gain access to the ANSI Z50.2 standard that focuses on bakery equipment design. And there's a way to contact myself. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer those questions at any time.
Sounds good. And Karl, thank you. You've done a couple of webinars with us here at FPSA, and it's always an educational experience, whether we're talking about different methods of cleaning and, reducing water usage or what the considerations are for hygienic design. We appreciate your expertise and sharing that with other food producers and equipment manufacturers. I'm going to wrap things up. Just a reminder that this was sponsored by the Food Production Solutions Association. There are a couple of other events like this coming up in the near future. Next Wednesday, the Beverage Council is sponsoring a discussion about the dairy processing industry's capital spending insights for next year with some of the challenges they're facing. And related to that, also what to do about water consumption in beverage manufacturing and in other food manufacturing processes. That's going to be on December 10th. If you're interested in some personal development, the Women's Alliance Network has a book club, and they're going to be talking about the book, How to Reignite the Joy of Leading People, based on the book Burnt Out to Lit Up. You can find out about the timing and where to get the book for that at the FPSA website. And last and certainly not least, make sure you set aside some time next March to get away from cold weather. Go to Rancho Mirage, California for the Food Solutions Exchange and Conference, FSX 2026. 3-day event that's going to have a host of impactful presentations dealing with everything from labor retention issues to manufacturing product problems, ingredients, regulatory issues facing the industry. And again, if all the cool kids are going to be there, so make sure you're with them. And with that, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. And make sure you take some time and learn more about FPSA at fpsa.org. Thank you.